Imagine working tirelessly to build your career, only to have your dreams shattered by an unexpected twist. You're a black employee, working hard, staying quiet, doing everything right. But then, in an instant, the person who holds your future, in their hands, the CEO of your company, fires you based on nothing but prejudice. But the kicker? She has no idea who you really are. At a prestigious tech company, this was the story of Elijah Scott, a quiet but ambitious software engineer who had always believed in working hard and keeping his head down. For him, success wasn't about playing the political game. It was about proving himself through skill and dedication. But little did he know, a simple misunderstanding would lead to one of the most dramatic power shifts the company had ever seen. Elijah had been with the company for 3 years. In that time, he had consistently exceeded his performance goals, earning the respect of his peers, and proving that he had the technical expertise to lead the next generation of projects. But one day, everything changed. It started with a meeting that was scheduled by the CEO, Catherine White, who had made a name for herself as a tough and decisive leader. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and was often admired for her ability to take the company to new heights. But behind the polished exterior, Catherine harbored deep prejudices that she kept hidden from the public eye. Elijah, always the professional, had received an email from HR stating that Catherine wanted to meet with him to discuss a performance issue. He knew something wasn't right. Elijah had no performance issues. His work had always been exemplary. But he figured it was just a routine check-in and walked into that meeting unprepared for what was about to unfold. "Mr. Scott," Catherine began, her tone sharp, "we've been looking at your performance over the last quarter, and there have been some concerns raised." Elijah felt his stomach drop. He had been working overtime, pulling extra shifts, staying late to make sure every line of code was flawless. How could this be happening? "I know I've been putting in a lot of work," Elijah replied carefully, trying to remain composed. "But I assure you my projects are on track. If there's any issue, I'd like to address it." Catherine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she flicked through her papers, making Elijah feel like he was on trial. Finally, she looked him straight in the eye and delivered the blow. "I'm sorry, Mr. Scott, but I've decided to let you go," she said coldly. "We need someone who is more aligned with our company values." Elijah was stunned. "Aligned with our company values?" he repeated, trying to comprehend what was happening. "I've been here 3 years. I've done everything asked of me. If there's a mistake, I'm willing to fix it. But firing me, this is final." Catherine interrupted. "We've made our decision. Pack up your things." The shock left Elijah speechless. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. A career he had poured his heart and soul into, gone in an instant. He was left standing in Catherine's office, feeling as though the floor had been pulled out from beneath him. But what Catherine didn't know was that Elijah was no ordinary employee. Yes, he had been just another engineer in her eyes, but in reality, Elijah was the son of one of the company's largest investors, a man whose wealth and influence rivaled even the most powerful players in the tech industry. Elijah's father had always kept a low profile, preferring to remain behind the scenes, but he had quietly amassed a large enough stake in the company to one day hold the reins. Elijah, being groomed for leadership, was set to take over when the time was right. As Elijah left the office that day, his heart heavy with betrayal, he made a decision. He wasn't going to let this slide. He wasn't just going to walk away quietly, not when he knew the truth. He had been wronged by someone who had let her prejudice cloud her judgment, and he was going to make sure that Catherine would learn a lesson she would never forget. The next day, Elijah went straight to his father's office. He needed to speak to him about what had happened, but he also needed to figure out how to move forward. He knew his father would never want to interfere directly in the company's day-to-day operations, but this was different. Elijah had worked hard to earn his position. He wasn't going to let a CEO with a narrow mind take everything away from him. "Dad," Elijah began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I've been let go. Catherine fired me." His father raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" Elijah recounted the meeting, the coldness in Catherine's voice, and the inexplicable decision to fire him without cause. He also explained that he had been excelling in his work, not falling short of any expectations. "Dad, I'm done being pushed around. I want to take this company for myself. I want to make things right." His father looked at him, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Elijah knew the next steps were up to him, and his father's silence was an unspoken affirmation. Elijah would fight back, not for revenge, but for justice. It was time for Catherine to realize who she was really dealing with. Elijah waited patiently, allowing time to pass before he made his move. But his plan wasn't about rushing into a confrontation. It was about letting Catherine's arrogance and prejudice show in full force. He knew that the longer she operated with the assumption that she was in control, the more vulnerable she would become. One day, Catherine received an email in the morning. It was a simple message with the subject line, "A note from the board of directors." She opened it to find a brief note stating that a new CEO was being appointed immediately, and Elijah Scott, her former employee, was being reinstated as the CEO of Fitzwater Technologies. Her heart dropped. The email was short, but its message was clear. Elijah, the employee she had unjustly fired, had not only been brought back to the company, but was now at the helm of it. As the weeks passed, Elijah's re-entry into the company was marked by significant changes. The transition was smooth at first, as Elijah made sure to implement policies that prioritized merit and equality, things he had always believed in but had never been given a chance to execute. He had a vision for the company, a vision of inclusion, innovation, and success, and as the new CEO, he was determined to make it a reality. But Catherine's reaction was far from quiet. In the background, she seethed, her pride bruised by the shocking turn of events. She had spent years at the top of the ladder, commanding respect and making decisions without question. She had always believed that her position was unassailable, but now, her entire world had been turned upside down. Catherine had underestimated Elijah, not realizing that his family's wealth and influence were merely the tip of the iceberg. Elijah had grown up with the understanding that the power of knowledge, work ethic, and strategy was what truly mattered. His father had taught him from a young age that leadership was about inspiring change, not wielding power for personal gain. Now, as the CEO, Elijah was bringing that ethos to life. The company began to change in subtle but significant ways. Employee morale skyrocketed, as many of the staff members who had felt stifled under Catherine's regime were finally given a voice. The culture began to shift from one of fear and silence to one of openness and collaboration. Elijah's leadership wasn't about making himself look good. It was about making sure the entire company thrived. Yet as much as Elijah worked to make improvements, Catherine couldn't sit idly by. She had been reduced to a shadow of her former self, attending meetings only when necessary, and making small, almost futile attempts to regain some influence in the company. But her time had passed. The company was no longer hers. One day, Catherine approached Elijah in his office. The door opened slowly, and there she stood, her posture stiff, her eyes wary. It was the first time they had been in the same room since the day of her firing. "Elijah," she started, her voice tight. "I never thought you'd come back. I thought you'd just let it go, disappear, and let things go back to normal. But now you're sitting in my chair." Elijah didn't flinch. He had been preparing for this moment, knowing it would come eventually. "You underestimated me," he said quietly. "But it's not too late for you to change. You still have a chance to work with me, Catherine. I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to make this company better." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "And what if I don't want to work with you? What if I want to fight for what's mine?" Elijah leaned forward, meeting her gaze with a calm intensity. "It's not about what's yours anymore. The company is bigger than both of us, but the decision is yours. You can stay, be part of this vision, or you can keep fighting a battle you've already lost." Catherine stood silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, she spoke. "Fine, I'll work with you. But don't think I'm going to just forget what happened." Elijah nodded. "I don't expect you to. But it's time for a new beginning." Catherine left his office that day with a new understanding of Elijah's power, not just in terms of his position, but in his ability to rise above the personal animosity that had once ruled the company. But the real test was still ahead. Elijah knew that the battle for the soul of the company wasn't over. There were people in high places who had always supported Catherine and would likely try to undermine his leadership. Elijah had to remain vigilant, ready to make the difficult decisions that would ensure the company's success and keep it on the path of integrity and fairness. It wasn't just about proving himself to Catherine or the board members. It was about proving to the employees, his peers, and most importantly, to himself, that he was the right leader for this company. In the coming months, Elijah's decisions began to pay off. Under his leadership, the company saw not only financial success, but also a cultural renaissance. Employees felt heard and valued, and the company's innovative edge sharpened. What once seemed like a company riddled with inequality and corruption was now being recognized for its commitment to justice, fairness, and opportunity for all. But Catherine, despite agreeing to work alongside him, continued to harbor a quiet resentment. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been replaced, that she had been made a fool of. While Elijah continued to build the company, her simmering jealousy and bitterness began to show, and in time, she started to subtly undermine him. She would make veiled comments during meetings, question his decisions, and work behind the scenes to rally some of the board members who had once supported her. However, Elijah was aware of her moves. He had come to learn that the key to success was not just leading with strategy, but also leading with emotional intelligence. He understood that Catherine's resentment wasn't personal. It was born out of pride and fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being forgotten, and pride in the years she had spent building the company, thinking it was all for nothing. One afternoon, Elijah called a meeting with the board members. He knew it was time to address the situation head-on. The tension between him and Catherine had become too much of a distraction, and it was beginning to affect the morale of the entire company. When they were all seated, Elijah looked directly at Catherine. "I know there's been some tension between us," he began, "but I want to be clear. I didn't take this position to tear you down. I want to build something we can both be proud of. But I can't do that if there's division within our ranks. We need to move forward, together." Catherine met his gaze, a flicker of something in her eyes. Whether it was resignation or grudging respect, Elijah couldn't tell. But it didn't matter. She had finally realized that the company, like the future, was bigger than either of them. And so, they moved forward. Together. Elijah Scott, the quiet man who had been underestimated and cast aside, had not only claimed his rightful place at the helm of the company, but had also proven that real leadership comes from humility, resilience, and a commitment to justice and equality. As the months went by, Elijah's leadership continued to flourish. He implemented new strategies that focused on inclusion, fostering a healthy work environment, and bringing in innovative ideas that began to make the company not just profitable, but a model of corporate responsibility. But even as his influence grew, a nagging feeling persisted in the back of his mind. There were still people who didn't trust him. The whispers didn't die down. It wasn't just Catherine and the board members who were unsure of him. There were employees who had been loyal to her for years, employees who had seen the company through its most difficult times. Some of them had been unsure about Elijah's intentions from the beginning, and while they respected his position, they were still skeptical. They had lived through enough corporate power struggles to know that the higher you climb, the harder the fall. But Elijah was determined. He wasn't just going to lead through the power of his position. He wanted to prove to them that he was the leader they needed. But deep down, Elijah knew this wasn't just about gaining their trust. It was about securing the future of the company. But with every step forward, another challenge arose. Was his rise to power truly legitimate? Did the fact that Catherine had never expected his return create a bigger obstacle than he anticipated? One day, Elijah received an unexpected visitor, a former colleague from his previous position at the tech firm, a company he'd left behind when he joined his father's company. His old friend Maya had a way of cutting to the chase, and today was no different. "Elijah, you need to watch your back," she said, leaning in with intensity. He looked at her quizzically, the weight of her words registering immediately. He knew there was something troubling about this meeting. Maya didn't just drop by unless something was amiss. "What's going on?" Elijah asked, his tone neutral, yet his mind raced with possibilities. Maya glanced around the quiet cafe. They sat in, ensuring no one was listening. She lowered her voice. "There's a rumor spreading. Catherine's been reaching out to certain people, trying to get them to side with her. She's making moves behind the scenes, and it's not just the employees you need to worry about. There are some big investors who feel that her legacy is being overshadowed. If they decide to turn against you, it could be catastrophic." Elijah sat back in his chair, his mind churning. He had known that Catherine's pride was wounded, but to think she would go this far, to plot against him in such a calculated way, left him speechless. But Maya wasn't done. She gave him a pointed look. "There's more. I overheard a conversation between two of her old allies. They're planning to sabotage your next product launch. If you don't act fast, it could not only ruin the launch, but it could severely damage your reputation." Elijah's mind was already turning over the facts. He had known Catherine was a force to be reckoned with, but this was a different level of underhanded tactics. He needed to act quickly. The weight of responsibility, the eyes of the company, the employees, and even his own family, all were now on him. He couldn't afford to let this sabotage succeed. The question now wasn't whether he could prove himself as CEO. It was whether he could survive the power struggle Catherine had set in motion. Maya's words hung heavy in the air as Elijah left the cafe that afternoon. He didn't know how he would tackle this challenge, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to back down. It wasn't just his company at stake. His entire vision of corporate fairness, justice, and equality hung in the balance. As Elijah prepared for what lay ahead, the stakes grew higher with every passing day. He worked tirelessly, thinking of ways to outmaneuver Catherine's secretive efforts. But as time passed, he began to notice more subtle shifts, more whispers in the hallways, more employees eyeing him with suspicion. Catherine was pulling strings behind the scenes, and it was clear that the fight for control over the company was far from over. As the tension between them continued to escalate, Elijah was forced to ask himself, how far was Catherine willing to go to destroy him? And how far would he be willing to go to save the company and the integrity he had worked so hard to build? The next few weeks would be a test, not just of Elijah's leadership, but of his resolve. The board meeting that was approaching seemed to hold the final answer to everything. Would he be able to prove his worth to the board members and investors? Would the company finally choose his vision over Catherine's? Or would the company succumb to the shadows of the past and its corrupt underbelly? Elijah had always prided himself on doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. But now he was faced with a decision that would change the entire course of his career. It was no longer about proving himself to anyone. It was about securing the future of the company and ensuring that his vision could thrive. And as the company's future hung in the balance, one final confrontation loomed on the horizon. Elijah versus Catherine. The twist. Elijah had no intention of fighting dirty. Instead, he would rely on the truth and the integrity that had guided him all along. But would that be enough to ensure victory? Or would Catherine's grip on the company prove to be stronger than he ever imagined? As the weeks went by, the tension in the company's boardrooms continued to escalate. Elijah had a plan. He wasn't just going to let Catherine and her supporters dismantle everything he had worked for. But the deeper he delved into the company's internal politics, the more he realized just how deep the corruption ran. Elijah couldn't deny that Catherine wasn't alone in this. There were other influential players, people who had been loyal to her for years, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. Elijah had always known that climbing the corporate ladder wasn't easy, but this was a whole different ballgame. He wasn't just facing an old rival. He was up against a system that had protected its own for far too long. But Elijah wasn't the type to shy away from a challenge, especially not one that could affect the lives of the people who had come to depend on the company. His employees were loyal, and he would do anything to protect them from the chaos that Catherine was trying to stir up. Behind the scenes, Catherine was pulling every string she could to undermine him. She was leveraging her old allies, some of the most powerful board members, to launch an attack on Elijah's leadership. Whispers spread like wildfire through the halls of the office, and every move Elijah made was scrutinized. The whispers were no longer just about him being the new CEO. Now, the narrative was shifting. Some began to question his ability to lead. Others doubted whether he truly had the company's best interests at heart. All the while, Elijah remained focused on the task at hand. One morning, as Elijah was preparing for yet another critical board meeting, a trusted confidant, Sarah, a senior advisor who had been with the company for nearly a decade, told him something that made his blood run cold. Elijah, we've got something big coming and we need to act fast. Catherine's got a plan to release some damaging information about you. Stuff that's going to ruin your reputation if it gets out. It's a smear campaign, and it's coming. For you full force, but I think we can get ahead of it. Elijah's mind raced. Sarah was one of the few people he trusted completely, and when she spoke, he listened. What kind of information? Elijah asked, his voice steady despite the sense of dread creeping up on him. It's personal. She's been digging into your background, your family, your history. There's a rumor that she's got something. Something that could make it look like you've been hiding something from the board. We're talking about your father's business connections. Some stuff that could be twisted to paint you as a liability. Elijah's heart sank. His father had always been a successful entrepreneur, but there were certain aspects of his past that Elijah had chosen to distance himself from. He had always worked to build his own reputation, independent of his father's wealth and influence. If Catherine was going to expose this to the board, it could turn everything upside down. Then we need to act fast, Elijah said, determination filling his voice. We can't let this go public. Sarah nodded. Exactly, I've already started gathering some intel, and I think we can turn this around. But you need to be prepared for a full-on war. Catherine is ruthless, and she won't stop until she gets what she wants. Elijah was used to fighting battles. He had faced challenges throughout his entire career. But this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for a promotion or recognition. He was fighting for his future, for his credibility, and for the future of the company he had worked tirelessly to build. The stakes had never been higher. As the day of the board meeting approached, Elijah doubled down on his efforts. He stayed late in the office, poring over legal documents and strategies. He made calls to contacts, organizing a team to investigate Catherine's claims and ensure there were no skeletons left in the closet. He knew that if he could expose the truth before Catherine's attack came to light, he would not only defend his reputation, but also show the board that he was the right person to lead the company into the future. Meanwhile, Catherine was not idle. She was making her final moves, preparing her own arsenal of attacks. The war was far from over, and Elijah knew that the next few days would determine the trajectory of his future. He had a vision for the company, a vision that was centered on inclusivity, growth, and stability. But to make it a reality, he needed to overcome the resistance that had been cultivated by years of old-school corporate tactics. On the day of the board meeting, Elijah walked into the conference room, his demeanor calm but his mind alert. He had prepared himself for anything Catherine and her allies could throw his way. He sat at the head of the table, his gaze steady, his posture confident. But as the meeting progressed, he began to realize that the battle had already started. Members of the board who had once been his strongest supporters were now speaking against him, questioning his leadership and suggesting that perhaps Catherine's way was the better path for the company. As the discussion grew more heated, Elijah's pulse quickened. He knew this was his moment. It was time to strike. He stood up, his voice strong and unwavering as he addressed the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent the last several months doing everything in my power to make this company stronger. I've put in the work, and I've built a vision for this company's future. But I stand before you today not just as the CEO, but as a man who believes in the power of truth. Catherine, you've tried to attack my reputation, and now I'm asking you, do you really want to go down this path?" A hush fell over the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. Elijah continued, his words cutting through the tension. "I'm not here to play games. I'm here to make sure that the company we've built doesn't fall into the hands of those who would use it for their own personal gain. I've seen the damage that can be done when power is abused, and I won't let that happen on my watch." The silence was deafening, and for a moment Elijah felt a flicker of doubt, but he pushed it aside, knowing that he had one final piece of evidence that would change everything. He turned to Sarah, who nodded and handed him a folder. Elijah opened it, revealing the documents that exposed Catherine's underhanded tactics, her attempts to manipulate the board, and the emails that linked her to the smear campaign against him. "This," Elijah said, "is the truth. And if you choose to ignore it, then you're choosing to ignore the very values this company was founded upon." The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, one of the board members, an older gentleman with a reputation for being level-headed, spoke up. "Elijah, I had no idea," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "We've been in the dark about this. We've been misled." It was a turning point. Elijah had not only exposed the truth, but also shown the board that he was a leader they could trust, one who was willing to fight for the integrity of the company. The tide had shifted, and Catherine, realizing that her grip on power was slipping, tried one last desperate move. But it was too late. The board voted overwhelmingly in favor of Elijah, confirming his position as CEO and rejecting Catherine's influence. As the meeting came to a close, Elijah felt a sense of relief wash over him. The battle was far from over, but today he had won. The company would be led by the values of honesty, integrity, and inclusion. As Elijah walked out of the boardroom, he knew that he had just begun a new chapter in his leadership journey. He had faced the storm head-on, and despite the odds stacked against him, he had come out victorious. The road ahead would be challenging, but Elijah was ready for it. He knew that the real work had just begun. The boardroom had voted in his favor, and Catherine's hold over the company was shattered. But there were still plenty of challenges ahead. Elijah's focus now shifted to rebuilding the company's image, something that had been tarnished by the drama and manipulation. The board was in his corner, but he had to prove to the employees, the shareholders, and even the media that his leadership wasn't just about power. It was about the vision and the values he stood for. Elijah spent the following days meeting with key team leaders and department heads, discussing the vision for the company's future. He emphasized transparency, collaboration, and integrity. He shared his plans for new initiatives, ones that would foster an inclusive work environment, enhance the company's social responsibility programs, and allow every employee, no matter their background, to have a voice. Elijah wasn't just focused on profit margins or stock prices. His priority was to create a workplace where people felt valued and respected. The damage caused by Catherine's tactics would take time to heal, but he was committed to making things right. While Elijah focused on the company's internal affairs, the media was also catching wind of the story. News outlets and bloggers were abuzz with the details of his rise to power, his battle with Catherine, and his victorious stand against corruption. As the story made headlines, Elijah quickly realized that he needed to carefully manage the company's public relations. His every move was being watched, scrutinized, and analyzed. He had a team of experts handling press releases and media interviews, but Elijah personally reached out to a few reporters he trusted. He wanted to make sure the story was framed in the right way. No longer would the company be seen as a place where power struggles and dirty tactics were the norm. It was time for a new narrative, one where integrity triumphed and where leadership meant listening to people, not just pulling the strings behind the scenes. The media coverage continued, and Elijah's story gained momentum. The press adored the underdog story, a man of color starting at the bottom, working his way up against all odds, only to face a vicious corporate attack from the very people who were supposed to support him. But it wasn't just about the drama. It was about the fact that Elijah had weathered the storm and emerged with dignity, integrity, and an unshakable commitment to doing the right thing. As the months passed, Elijah's leadership began to be recognized not just by the employees within the company, but by those in the industry. He started getting calls for speaking engagements, invitations to sit on panels about corporate ethics, and opportunities to network with other successful leaders. The very traits that had been used to undermine him, his honesty, his commitment to justice, were now the things that set him apart from other CEOs. However, just as things began to settle into a rhythm, a new complication arose. Catherine, despite her failure to gain control of the company, didn't just disappear quietly into the background. Elijah received a call one afternoon from his legal team. A formal complaint had been filed by Catherine. She was attempting to discredit Elijah by alleging that he had manipulated evidence and engaged in unethical behavior during their battle for control. Elijah was taken aback by the accusation. He knew that the smear campaign had been a desperate attempt on Catherine's part to hold on to power, but to formally attack his character like this was a whole new level of animosity. The complaint threatened to tarnish his reputation once more, potentially undoing the progress he had worked so hard to rebuild. But Elijah wasn't someone who backed down from a fight. He had already proven his resilience once, and this time wouldn't be any different. He instructed his legal team to prepare a full, transparent response. Elijah personally drafted a statement outlining the events that had transpired and provided evidence that Catherine's accusations were baseless. He wanted the truth to be clear. He had never manipulated the system for personal gain. He had fought for fairness, for transparency, and for the company's future. The legal battle that ensued was long and drawn out. It wasn't just about the legalities. It was a matter of public perception. The media picked up on the story once again, and Elijah's name was once again in the spotlight. Some rallied behind him, praising his commitment to integrity, while others tried to undermine him, echoing Catherine's claims. But Elijah stayed focused on what mattered: the company, its employees, and the vision he had for the future. In the end, the legal system sided with Elijah. The charges against him were dismissed, and Catherine's claims were proven to be without merit. But even though the legal battle was over, the emotional toll it took on him was undeniable. Elijah realized that no matter how successful he became, there would always be those who tried to tear him down. The world wasn't always fair, but he had learned that the fight for what was right was always worth it. Months later, Elijah sat in his office, looking out at the city skyline. He had fought hard to get to where he was, and though the road had been difficult, it had shaped him into the leader he was today. The company had turned around under his leadership, and employees were flourishing. The workplace culture had transformed into one of inclusivity and mutual respect. His efforts to diversify the board and provide more opportunities for underrepresented groups had paid off. The company's performance had improved, and they were now on track to make a bigger impact in the industry than ever before. But Elijah knew that this was just the beginning. The lessons he had learned along the way would guide him for the rest of his career. He had fought against a system that had been built on corruption, but it wasn't just about winning. It was about changing that system for good. Elijah was determined to make a difference, not just for his company, but for the entire business world. And as he sat there, contemplating the journey ahead, one thing was clear. No matter what challenges arose, Elijah would face them with the same tenacity and integrity that had carried him to this point. He was ready for whatever came next, and this time, nothing would stand in his way. He knew the hardest battles were still ahead. He had overcome the intense personal and legal challenges that had threatened his position, but he was now faced with the task of solidifying his legacy as a leader who could not only handle adversity, but also inspire others to follow in his footsteps. Despite the legal victory, the media had painted him as the hero of the story. But Elijah didn't see it that way. He wasn't just fighting for his reputation. He was fighting for the future of his company, his employees, and a corporate system that he believed could be better. He knew that he needed to prove that his leadership wasn't just about one moment of success or overcoming a crisis. It was about changing the corporate world for the better in the long run. He began to focus more on corporate social responsibility, CSR initiatives. He knew that for a company to truly thrive in today's world, it needed to give back. He launched several new programs aimed at supporting underprivileged communities and increasing diversity within the tech industry. Elijah personally oversaw partnerships with nonprofits that supported education, job training, and affordable housing in marginalized communities. He wasn't just trying to create a profitable company. He wanted to build a lasting legacy of positive change. One of his most important initiatives was the company's mentorship program, where senior executives were paired with young talent from diverse backgrounds. Elijah himself became a mentor, sitting down with promising young employees and guiding them through their careers. It was a chance for him to pass on the lessons he had learned throughout his journey: resilience, integrity, and the importance of fighting for what was right. But even as his company thrived, the personal toll of his battle with Catherine and the corruption she represented still weighed heavily on Elijah. He had seen firsthand the length some people would go to in order to protect their own power, and he was acutely aware of the dangers that lurked in the corporate world. He realized that his success had made him a target for others who saw him as a threat. The higher you climbed, the more eyes there were on you, and not all of them were friendly. One afternoon, as he was walking through the halls of his office, Elijah was approached by one of his trusted advisors, Carla. She was the head of corporate strategy, and she had been working closely with Elijah on the company's long-term vision. Her face was serious as she approached him, and Elijah knew something was wrong. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "It's about the board." Elijah's heart sank. He had worked hard to rebuild trust within the company, but the last thing he wanted to hear was that the very people who had supported him might be turning against him. He followed Carla into a private conference room, and she sat him down. "There's a growing movement among certain members of the board," Carla explained. "They're unhappy with the changes you've implemented, especially your focus on diversity and CSR. They're worried it's taking the company off course, that we're becoming too focused on social causes and not enough on profit. They're questioning whether you're the right person to lead." Elijah listened in stunned silence. He had known that the changes he was making wouldn't be universally accepted, but he hadn't expected such a direct challenge to his leadership. "I've worked my entire life to get to this point," Elijah said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I can't go back now. I'm doing this for the future of the company and for the people who've supported me." Carla nodded, but her expression was grim. "I know, and I'm with you. But this is bigger than just us. The board is split, and we need to act fast to preserve your position." Elijah's mind raced. He had fought too hard to let the people who had tried to tear him down have the last word. This was his moment to prove that his leadership wasn't just a fluke, and he wasn't going to let anyone undo everything he had worked for. The next few days were a whirlwind. Elijah met with each member of the board individually, laying out his vision for the future of the company. He talked about the importance of balancing social responsibility with profitability, emphasizing that the two could go hand in hand. He shared the success stories of companies that had embraced diversity and had seen their profits soar because of it, and he made it clear that he would not back down from his commitment to change. The final meeting with the board was tense. Elijah stood before them, confident and unwavering as the members deliberated. There were heated arguments, but in the end, Elijah's vision won out. The board voted to support him, reaffirming his position as CEO. It was a hard-won victory, but Elijah knew that it was only the beginning. As the dust settled, Elijah took a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. He had faced down corruption, fought for what he believed in, and come out on top. But he knew that there were always more battles to fight. The corporate world was a constant struggle for power, influence, and control, and Elijah was determined to keep pushing for change. In the years that followed, Elijah's company continued to thrive. Under his leadership, they made strides in sustainability, diversity, and social responsibility. They became a beacon for others in the industry, showing that profitability and doing the right thing weren't mutually exclusive. Elijah had not only secured his position, but had also reshaped the very fabric of the corporate world. But even with all the success, Elijah knew one thing for certain. He would never stop fighting for what was right. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about power or money. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, challenging the status quo, and making the world a better place for everyone. Elijah stood on the balcony of his office, gazing out at the skyline. The city below seemed like a reflection of his journey, tall buildings representing the challenges he had faced and overcome, the paths he had carved in the corporate world. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the legacy he was building wasn't just about success or wealth, but about creating a system where justice and fairness could thrive. As he turned back into his office, the weight of his accomplishments hit him all at once. There had been moments when he had doubted himself, times when the pressure felt unbearable, when it seemed like the entire world was working against him. But here he was, standing firm, a leader who had faced corruption and prejudice head-on, who had defied the odds and come out victorious. He thought of the employees who now looked to him for inspiration, the diverse group of talented people who saw his story as a beacon of hope, a reminder that anything was possible, with resilience and integrity. Elijah's vision wasn't just about transforming a company, it was about transforming a culture where everyone, no matter their background, had an equal chance to rise, to shine, to succeed. But as proud as he was of how far he had come, Elijah knew the fight wasn't over. There were still so many systems to challenge, so many injustices to address. The journey ahead would be filled with new hurdles, but this time, Elijah was ready. He had proven to himself, and the world, that one person could make a difference. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Carla, his trusted advisor and friend. She stood there with a grin on her face, holding a file in her hands. "Looks like we've got more work to do," she said, a hint of excitement in her voice. Elijah smiled, standing tall. "Always," he replied. "Let's do this." As Carla handed him the file, Elijah's mind began to race with possibilities. There were new frontiers to explore, new industries to revolutionize, and more lives to change. This was his calling, to be more than just a CEO, but a catalyst for real, lasting change in the corporate world. With a deep breath, Elijah took the file and walked to the desk, ready to dive into the next chapter. His story wasn't over, not by a long shot. In fact, it was just beginning. The fight for equality, justice, and a better future wasn't something that could be won in a single battle. But with each step forward, with each challenge faced and conquered, Elijah was proving that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And he would be there, leading the charge, every step of the way. As Elijah settled into his chair, he looked out the window once more, feeling the weight of everything he had accomplished, and the even greater weight of everything that was still to come. His journey had just begun. There was more to build, more to achieve, and with each passing day, Elijah knew the fight for a more just, fair, and inclusive future was one that was worth fighting, no matter how long it took. And so, with the city stretching out before him like an endless canvas, Elijah smiled. His story, the one of perseverance, transformation, and justice, would echo long after he was gone. Because when you change the world doesn't forget. In the end, Elijah's triumph wasn't just about securing his place as CEO. It was about breaking down the walls of corruption and inequality that had existed for so long. He didn't just win the battle for himself. He won it for everyone who believed that integrity could triumph over injustice. His journey serves as a reminder that sometimes the most challenging paths lead to the most rewarding destinations. When you fight for what's right, you create not just a legacy, but a movement that has the power to inspire generations to come. If Elijah's story resonates with you, and if you're ready to challenge the status quo and make a difference in your own life, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change, ignite passion, and drive innovation. Because in the end, change starts with you.